The second Ryan shoved me into the kitchen counter, the edge caught me just below the ribs. My coffee mug hit the tile and broke into 3 pieces. He looked down at me and said, "Don't make this worse." That was when I reached for my phone. I didn't call 911, not yet. I opened the old text thread labeled Dad and typed the 3 words he had taught me years ago. "Need you now." Then I hit send. My name is Emily Carter. I was 46 that winter, an Army logistics officer assigned to Fort Campbell, Kentucky, though Ryan and I lived across the state line in Clarksville, Tennessee. Our house sat in one of those newer subdivisions off Tiny Town Road, where every driveway had a pickup truck, a basketball hoop, or both. From the outside, we looked steady, respectable even. Ryan worked as a regional operations manager for a private security company in Nashville. He wore pressed khakis, carried 2 phones, and liked telling people he was in executive leadership, even though most of his job involved scheduling guards and arguing over mileage reports. I had spent 22 years in uniform. I knew how to manage a crisis, move supplies through a storm, and keep 30 tired soldiers focused when nothing was going right. At home, though, I had become skilled at making excuses. "He's under pressure." He didn't mean it that way. He just has a temper. That night, the excuses ran out. Ryan had started drinking before dinner. 2 bourbons, then a third, while I heated leftover meatloaf from Publix. He was already angry because my father had stopped by that afternoon to replace the loose rail on our back steps. "Your dad needs to quit acting like this is his house," Ryan said. "He fixed a safety problem. He pokes around like some lonely old handyman." I set down the serving spoon. "His name is Jack, and he was trying to help." Ryan laughed through his nose. "Jack, right. The silent cowboy in the 20-year-old Ford." My father was 71, broad-shouldered but lean with silver at his temples, and hands rough from years of work. He spoke softly, drove an old F-150, and never told stories about himself. Ryan took that quietness for weakness. He had no idea Dad had spent 26 years in the Navy. He had no idea he had once been a SEAL. I had never told him because Dad asked me not to. He didn't hide from shame. He simply believed the past belonged in the past. Ryan stepped closer. "You always choose him." "That isn't true." "It is tonight." I turned away and his hand closed around my upper arm. Hard. "Let go of me." He did, but only to shove me. After I sent the text, Ryan stared at the broken mug and seemed almost surprised by what he had done. Then, exactly 10 minutes later, 3 hard knocks shook the front door. Ryan smiled. "Your old man came to rescue you." I looked at the clock above the stove. 8:47 p.m. Then I walked toward the door. Ryan reached the front door before I did. He looked back at me with that smug little grin I'd seen too many times over the years. "What did your daddy leave his fishing pole here?" Another knock. Steady, firm, not angry. Just confident. Ryan unlocked the deadbolt and swung the door open. My father stood on the porch wearing faded blue jeans, a brown work jacket, and the same old boots he'd worn for years. His gray hair was damp from a light February rain, and his pickup was still idling in the driveway. At first glance, he looked exactly like the man Ryan had spent years making fun of. A quiet widower. A retired guy who spent Saturdays fishing on Kentucky Lake and Sundays fixing neighbors' fences. Ryan chuckled. "Took you long enough." Dad didn't answer. His eyes moved past Ryan and settled on me. They immediately found the red marks on my arm. His expression didn't change. That was one thing I'd always admired about him. Even when something terrible happened, he never panicked. He simply observed. "You all right, Em?" he asked. My throat tightened. "I am now." Ryan folded his arms. "This is between my wife and me." Dad finally looked at him. "No," he said calmly. "It stopped being just between the 2 of you." Ryan laughed louder. "Oh, please." He looked back at me. "You actually called him." I texted him. "For this." Dad glanced toward the broken coffee mug on the kitchen floor, then back at my arm. "What happened?" he asked quietly. "I told him to let go." Dad nodded once. That was all. No shouting. No threats. No dramatic speeches. Just one small nod. Ryan rolled his eyes. "You know, Jack, I never understood why Emily acts like you're some kind of hero." Dad ignored him. "I'd like Emily to grab a coat." Ryan stepped in front of the doorway. "She's not going anywhere." Dad remained perfectly still. "I wasn't asking your permission." Something in his voice made even me pause. Not because it was loud. Because it wasn't. I'd heard that same calm tone once when I was 19. I'd come home from college after a terrible breakup, crying so hard I could barely breathe. Dad hadn't tried to solve everything. He'd simply made coffee, handed me a blanket, and said, "We'll figure out tomorrow." He always sounded like that. Steady. Ryan, on the other hand, mistook calm for weakness. He stepped closer to Dad until only a foot separated them. "You don't scare me." "I didn't come here to scare you." Ryan smirked. "Good, because you're just an old man." For a brief second, I saw something flash across Dad's face. Not anger. Sadness. He looked at Ryan the way a disappointed teacher looks at a student who keeps making the same mistake. "You've been married to my daughter for 9 years, Dad said. You've spent every holiday telling jokes at my expense." Ryan shrugged. "So, I let them go." "So, you called me useless?" Ryan grinned. "You are retired." Dad nodded. "You laughed at my truck. It's falling apart. You asked if I even knew how to use a smartphone." Ryan chuckled. "You barely text. I learned." Ryan looked confused. Dad reached into his jacket pocket and held up his own phone. "I got your message, Emily." Then he looked directly at me. "Did he put his hands on you?" I couldn't speak. I simply nodded. Dad slipped the phone back into his pocket. When he spoke again, his voice was almost gentle. "Emily, sweetheart, go pack an overnight bag." Ryan barked a laugh. "Or what?" Dad looked him straight in the eye. "You have 5 minutes to decide how difficult you want tonight to become." Ryan burst into laughter. "What are you going to do, beat me up?" Dad didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the driveway and raised one hand. Headlights appeared around the corner. Then another set. And another. 3 vehicles slowly pulled up in front of our house. Ryan's smile began to fade. 3 SUVs rolled to a stop along the curb in front of our house. Nobody rushed out. Nobody shouted. The engines shut off one by one, leaving our quiet neighborhood strangely silent except for a dog barking somewhere down the street. Ryan looked from the driveway to my father. "What is this?" Dad answered as calmly as ever. "Friends." The driver's door of the first SUV opened. Out stepped Mike Reynolds, a retired Montgomery County sheriff. I'd known Mike since I was a teenager. He'd coached Little League after retiring from law enforcement, and half the county still called him sheriff, even though he'd been out of office for years. The second vehicle carried Tom Alvarez, a retired Marine who now owned one of the largest private security companies in Middle Tennessee. He and Dad had gone fishing together for years. The third SUV held an older couple I recognized immediately, Bill and Diane Parker. They lived only a mile from Dad. Bill had served with him decades earlier. I had grown up calling them Uncle Bill and Aunt Diane, though we weren't related. Ryan frowned. "What, is this some kind of family reunion?" Nobody laughed. Mike walked up the driveway. "Evening, Jack." "Mike." Tom nodded toward Dad. "You got here fast." "I was closest." Ryan crossed his arms. "So you brought witnesses?" Mike looked directly at him. "No." His voice was steady. "We came because Jack said his daughter needed people she could trust." For the first time all evening, Ryan seemed unsure of himself. Dad finally stepped inside the doorway. He wasn't invading the house. He simply wanted a better look at me. He gently lifted my sleeve. The bruises were already darkening. His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "When?" he asked. "About 15 minutes ago." He nodded. "Anywhere else?" "My shoulder." "Did he hit your head?" "No." Ryan threw up his hands. "Oh, come on, I barely touched her." Mike spoke before anyone else could. "You might want to stop talking." Ryan scoffed. "I don't need legal advice." "No," Mike replied, "but you do need common sense." Ryan looked around as though everyone had lost their minds. It was an argument between husband and wife. Tom folded his arms. "That's not what I'm looking at." Dad finally turned toward Ryan. "You've got exactly one chance to do the right thing." Ryan laughed again, though this time it sounded forced. "And what's that?" "Emily is leaving with me tonight." "No." "You don't get to make that decision." "This is my house." Dad looked around the kitchen. The broken mug still lay scattered across the floor. A chair had been knocked sideways. My dinner sat untouched on the table. Then he looked back at Ryan. "No," he said quietly. "This is her home." I hadn't realized I was holding my breath until that moment. For months, maybe years, I had felt smaller inside my own house. Dad somehow reminded me in a single sentence that I still belonged there. Ryan pointed toward the front door. "Everybody get out." Dad didn't move. Instead, he looked at me. "Emily." "Yes." Go upstairs. I hesitated. I don't want to leave you. A faint smile crossed his face. I've handled harder conversations than this. I knew he had. Growing up, I'd asked him countless questions about his Navy career. He always smiled and changed the subject. Only once had he said something that stayed with me. The loudest man in the room usually knows the least. Standing there watching Ryan yell while my father barely raised his voice, I finally understood exactly what he meant. I carried an overnight bag downstairs 10 minutes later. Ryan was pacing. Mike stood near the doorway. Tom quietly swept the broken coffee mug into a dustpan. Nobody had argued. Nobody had threatened anyone. The silence itself had become uncomfortable. As I reached the front door, Ryan suddenly grabbed my suitcase. "You're not leaving." Before I could react, Dad stepped between us. Not aggressively, not dramatically, just enough that Ryan had to let go. Dad looked him straight in the eyes. "I asked you one question earlier." Ryan frowned. "What? Did you think she'd always be alone?" Ryan didn't answer. Neither did anyone else. Then red and blue lights reflected across the front windows. A Clarksville police cruiser slowly pulled into the driveway. Ryan's face went completely pale. The flashing lights outside should have made me feel safer. Instead, my stomach tightened. After 22 years in the Army, I'd learned one hard truth: when police arrive, nobody's life gets simpler. It just changes direction. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped onto the porch with his partner, Officer Melissa Grant. I recognized Brooks immediately. We'd crossed paths a few times at community events in Clarksville. He nodded politely when he saw me. "Evening, ma'am." Then he looked around. The broken mug. The overturned chair. Ryan standing in the middle of the kitchen. My father quietly beside me. Someone called about a domestic disturbance. Ryan pointed toward Dad before anyone else could speak. "Yeah, him. My father-in-law showed up with half the county trying to intimidate me." Officer Brooks didn't react. "Who called us?" Mike Reynolds raised a hand. I did. Brooks recognized him immediately. "Evening, Sheriff." "Mike's fine these days." Brooks smiled briefly before turning serious again. "What happened?" Ryan jumped in. "My wife got emotional. Her dad overreacted." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because emotional had become Ryan's favorite word anytime I disagreed with him. If dinner was late, I was emotional. If I questioned our finances, emotional. If I asked him not to insult my father, emotional. Officer Grant walked over to me. "Mrs. Carter, would you mind speaking with me outside for a moment?" I nodded. The February air was cold enough that my breath showed as we stood beside her patrol car. She didn't rush me. She simply asked, "Can you tell me what happened?" For the first time that night, I stopped protecting Ryan. He shoved me into the kitchen counter. "Did he strike you?" "No." "Did he grab you?" "Yes." "Can I see your arm?" I pulled back my sleeve. She examined the bruises carefully. "When did this happen?" "About half an hour ago." She looked me in the eyes. "Has anything like this happened before?" The question sat between us. I wanted to say no. Instead, I remembered little moments I'd buried. Ryan squeezing my wrist so hard at a restaurant that I couldn't hold my fork afterward. Him slamming a bedroom door inches from my face. Throwing my phone across the garage because I had answered a work call during dinner. None of those moments had seemed big enough to report. Together, they suddenly looked very different. I swallowed. "Yes." Officer Grant nodded gently. "Thank you for being honest." Meanwhile, Officer Brooks remained inside. A few minutes later, he came outside carrying a small evidence bag. Inside were the broken pieces of my coffee mug. "Body cameras running," he said quietly. "We're documenting everything." Ryan stepped onto the porch. "This is ridiculous." Brooks looked at him. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you stayed inside until we're finished." Ryan threw his hands in the air. "So now I'm the criminal?" "No one said that. This whole thing is because her father can't mind his own business." Dad finally spoke. "My daughter's safety is my business." Ryan smirked. "There you go again." Dad didn't answer. He never took the bait. About 20 minutes later, Officer Brooks walked over to me again. "Mrs. Carter?" "Yes." "One of your neighbors has a Ring camera facing your driveway." I frowned. "So, it captured part of what happened." Ryan's face changed. "What are you talking about?" Brooks continued. "It appears the camera caught you grabbing Mrs. Carter near the front porch before both of you went inside." Ryan blinked. That doesn't prove anything." "No," Brooks agreed. "It doesn't prove everything. But it proves more than you probably hoped." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, Ryan looked nervous. Still, as I loaded my overnight bag into Dad's truck, he forced a smile. "You'll be back in a day or two." I closed the passenger door without answering. As Dad pulled away from the curb, I glanced back through the rear window. Ryan was standing in the driveway with his arms crossed, shaking his head like he'd already convinced himself he'd won. He had no idea that what frightened me most wasn't tonight. It was finally admitting to myself. Tonight wasn't the beginning. It had been building for years. Dad's house sat on 5 quiet acres outside Dover, Tennessee, about 45 minutes from Clarksville. It wasn't fancy. White siding, a deep front porch, wind chimes that only rang when the breeze came up from the creek behind the property. I'd grown up there. Walking through the front door felt like stepping back into another version of myself. Dad took my overnight bag upstairs while I settled onto the living room couch. His yellow Labrador Duke rested his head on my knee as if he'd been waiting for me all along. "You hungry?" Dad asked from the kitchen. I realized I hadn't eaten dinner. I could manage a sandwich. "You'll get something better than that." Within half an hour, he had grilled cheese tomato soup and a slice of apple pie warming in the oven. It reminded me that no matter how old I got, I was still his little girl. Neither of us mentioned Ryan during dinner. Not once. The silence wasn't awkward. It was healing. The next morning I drove to Fort Campbell instead of taking leave. Routine has a strange way of keeping you steady. I checked inventory reports, approved transportation requests, answered emails, and sat through a logistics meeting that could have been an email. Every few minutes my phone buzzed. Ryan. 9 missed calls, 7 text messages, finally 1 voicemail. "Emily, this has gone way too far. Tell your father to back off." I deleted it without listening again. Around lunchtime, my closest friend, Major Lisa Henderson, found me sitting alone outside the headquarters building. She handed me a cup of coffee. "You okay?" "I've had better weeks." She studied my face. "I've known you 15 years. "I know." "You don't have to carry this alone." Those words almost broke me. Instead of crying, I told her everything. Not just about last night. About years of little insults. The jokes. The controlling behavior. The way Ryan always found a reason to make my father look small. Lisa listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said something simple. "Emily, none of that sounds normal." Hearing someone else say it out loud made it impossible to deny. That afternoon I met with a family attorney in Clarksville. Her name was Karen Whitmore. Gray hair, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. She reminded me of every practical grandmother I'd ever known. After listening for nearly an hour, she folded her hands. "I'd recommend filing for an order of protection." The words landed harder than I expected. "That feels serious." Karen gave me a kind smile. "Emily, what happened to you was serious." I signed the paperwork. My hand shook the entire time. When I got back to Dad's house, he was sitting on the back porch watching the sun disappear behind the trees. He didn't ask how the meeting went. He already knew. I filed. He nodded once. "I'm proud of you." "I don't feel brave." "You don't have to." After a long silence, he looked toward the woods. "I need to tell you something." I turned toward him. "What? You remember when Ryan interviewed for that security management job about 8 years ago?" I frowned. "Yeah, before he got promoted." Dad looked down at his coffee. "He wasn't their first choice." "What do you mean?" "The company owner served with someone I knew." I stared at him. "They called me." I blinked. "They knew who you were." "A few people did." "What did they ask?" "They wanted to know if Ryan had good character." My heart started beating faster. "What did you tell them?" Dad looked me in the eyes. "Nothing." "You said nothing." "I told them I wasn't comfortable recommending someone I didn't fully trust." I sat there speechless. "You never told me. It wasn't my place." "You could have ruined his career." "I wasn't trying to." He sighed. "I simply refused to lie." I leaned back in my chair. For years, Ryan had insisted he'd earned every promotion on his own. Now I realized something else. The people who had quietly respected my father all those years had never forgotten who he really was. And somewhere out there, those same people were about to hear what Ryan had done. People imagine revenge as one dramatic moment. One clever move. One perfect victory. Real life doesn't work that way. Most of the time, justice comes one uncomfortable day at a time. The order of protection was granted on a temporary basis 2 days later. Ryan was served at his office in Nashville. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it. Apparently, one of the receptionists later told a mutual friend that Ryan's face turned completely white when the deputy handed him the paperwork in front of several co-workers. By lunchtime, half the office knew. Ryan called me 17 times. I answered once. "What do you want?" I asked. "You embarrassed me." I almost laughed. "You embarrassed yourself. You didn't have to do this." "I didn't." "It was one argument." I closed my eyes. "No, Ryan." It was years of arguments. He was quiet for a second. Then he tried a different approach. "You know I love you." I waited. Nothing else came. No apology. No accountability. Just another attempt to move past what had happened. "I have to go," I said. "Emily." I ended the call. A week later, my attorney called. "Ryan hired a lawyer." I figured he would. "He's contesting everything." "Of course he is." Karen sighed. "He's claiming you're overreacting because of stress from military service." I stared out the office window at Fort Campbell. Soldiers hurried across the parking lot carrying rucksacks. Helicopters crossed the gray February sky. Stress. I'd spent years coordinating supply convoys through hurricanes. I'd worked 18-hour shifts during flood relief. I'd attended memorial services for soldiers I knew personally. None of that had made me afraid to go home. Ryan had. The next surprise came from somewhere I never expected. Sunday morning, I walked into church with Dad. People smiled, shook our hands. Everything felt normal. Until after the service. Tom Alvarez walked over. "Emily." "Morning, Tom." He hesitated. "I thought you should know something." "What?" "Ryan called me." I frowned. "Why?" "He wanted a job." My eyebrows lifted. "He already has one." "For now." Tom looked uncomfortable. "He said he was looking for options." "And I told him we weren't hiring." Dad remained silent beside me. Tom glanced at him before continuing. He also asked whether I'd speak to a couple of business owners he knows. "What did you tell him?" "The truth." "And what was that?" Tom's expression softened. "I told them I've known Jack Dawson for 30 years. He looked directly at me. "And if Jack says his daughter needed protection, that's all I need to hear." I looked at Dad. He hadn't made phone calls. He hadn't asked anyone to punish Ryan. People were making their own decisions. Ryan's world slowly began shrinking. One consulting client canceled a contract. Another postponed a meeting indefinitely. A leadership conference he'd been scheduled to attend quietly removed his name from the speaker list. Nothing dramatic. Nothing illegal. Just consequences. Meanwhile, my own emotions surprised me. One evening I sat on Dad's porch watching Duke chase squirrels across the yard. "I still miss him sometimes," I admitted. Dad nodded. "I know. I hate that I do." "You don't miss who he became." I looked over. "You miss who you hoped he'd become." That hit me harder than anything else, because he was right. I wasn't grieving the marriage I had. I was grieving the marriage I thought I could still save. The following Friday, Karen called again. "I need you to come in." "Bad news. I'm not sure yet." An hour later, she slid several bank statements across her desk. I recognized the account immediately. Our savings. The account we'd built for nearly 15 years. My stomach dropped. "Ryan transferred the money." Karen nodded. "Almost all of it." "How much?" She pointed to the total. $83,400. Gone. He moved it 3 weeks before the incident. 3 weeks. Before he ever shoved me. Before the police. Before I left. He hadn't acted in anger. He'd been planning. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the last piece of hope quietly disappear. For the first time since walking out of that house, I stopped wondering whether my marriage could be repaired. It couldn't. Because while I had been trying to save us, Ryan had already been planning for life without me. The day after I learned Ryan had emptied our savings account, I stopped asking myself why. Why had he changed? Why had he become so angry? Why wasn't I enough? Those questions had kept me awake for months. Now they felt pointless. Instead, I found myself thinking about someone else. My father. There were still so many things I didn't know about the man who had raised me. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Dad was already outside splitting firewood behind the barn when I walked over with 2 mugs of coffee. "You know you're 71, right?" I asked with a smile. He grinned. "So I've been told. You could have waited for me. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive." We stacked the last few logs together before sitting on the tailgate of his old Ford. For a while we just listened. The creek, the birds, the wind moving through the bare trees. Finally Dad spoke. "I owe you an explanation." I looked at him. For what? For never telling you much about my Navy years. I nodded. I've wondered. He stared across the pasture before answering. When people hear Navy SEAL, they imagine action movies. I laughed softly. I suppose they do. The truth is a lot quieter. He took a sip of coffee. And a lot heavier. He stood. Come with me. We walked into the detached garage behind the house. In one corner sat an old green military footlocker I'd seen my entire life. As a little girl, I'd asked what was inside. Dad always smiled. Old paperwork. I'd never questioned it. He knelt down, unlocked the latches, and slowly lifted the lid. Inside wasn't paperwork. At least not only paperwork. A neatly folded American flag. A Navy dress uniform sealed in plastic. Old photographs. Deployment notebooks. Challenge coins. A bronze star. A purple heart. Everything had been carefully wrapped and organized as though he'd packed it yesterday. I reached toward one photograph. Dad looked almost 30, standing beside 3 other young men, all smiling. Are they? My teammates. I noticed only 2 names had been written on the back. What happened to the others? His smile faded. They didn't come home. The garage fell silent. Dad gently picked up one of the notebooks. I used to think talking about those years honored them. He paused. Later I realized living a decent life honored them more. I swallowed hard. So that's why you never told people. I didn't need strangers thanking me. He smiled. I wanted my daughter to know how to fish change a tire, balance a checkbook, and keep her word. I laughed through the tears gathering in my eyes. You taught me all of those. I know. He reached into the footlocker again. This time he handed me a folded sheet of yellow paper. 3 words were written across the top. Need you now. My breath caught. You kept it. I wrote it the day you left for college. He smiled gently. You were 18. You told me if I ever truly needed you, I'd come. I always thought it was symbolic. Dad looked almost offended. I don't make promises I don't intend to keep. We both laughed. It was the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. Then he became serious again. Emily. Yeah. I wasn't the bravest person in this family. I frowned. What do you mean? I spent years overseas because I knew what the mission was. He looked directly into my eyes. You stayed in a difficult marriage because you loved someone and hoped he'd become better. He reached over and squeezed my shoulder. It takes courage to leave too. I finally let myself cry. Not because my marriage had ended, but because after all these years I finally understood my father. His greatest achievement wasn't surviving dangerous missions. It was coming home and choosing every single day to become the kind of father I needed. That afternoon, as we closed the footlocker together, neither of us noticed the black SUV slowing down on the road outside the property. Inside sat Ryan, watching. I didn't know Ryan had driven past Dad's house until the following Monday. Dad noticed the tire tracks near the mailbox when he went out to get the newspaper. He didn't mention them until after breakfast. I think Ryan was here yesterday. I looked up from my coffee. Did he stop? No. How do you know it was him? Our neighbor Earl called. He recognized Ryan's SUV. I felt a familiar knot form in my stomach. What did he want? Dad shrugged. I don't know. Then he looked at me. But whatever it was, he chose not to knock. 2 weeks later, we walked into the Montgomery County Courthouse in Clarksville. I'd been in military briefing rooms, command centers, and emergency operations buildings. None of them made me as nervous as that courtroom. Ryan was already there. His suit looked brand new. Blue tie. Fresh haircut. If you didn't know him, you'd think he was a respectable businessman, caught in an unfortunate misunderstanding. When he saw me, he smiled. It wasn't warm. It was calculated. His attorney, David Mercer, leaned over and whispered something that made Ryan chuckle. Dad noticed. He quietly said, "Keep looking at me. I don't want to look afraid." You won't. I feel afraid. He smiled. Courage isn't the absence of fear. I laughed softly. You really do have a saying for everything. I've had 71 years to collect them. That made me smile for the first time all morning. The hearing began promptly at 9. Judge Eleanor Mitchell entered the courtroom and everyone stood. She had a reputation for being fair, direct, and impossible to impress. Within minutes, Ryan's attorney was on his feet. Your Honor, my client deeply regrets a marital disagreement that has unfortunately been exaggerated. Marital disagreement. I almost couldn't believe those words, as if bruises appeared because 2 people disagreed about dinner. He continued. Mrs. Carter has spent over 2 decades in the military under extraordinary stress. We believe that stress has affected her perception of the incident. Karen Whitmore stood. Objection. Sustained, Judge Mitchell replied immediately. Karen didn't waste a second. Your Honor, we'd like to call Officer Melissa Grant. Officer Grant testified first. She described exactly what she'd seen. The bruises. My statement. Ryan's behavior that evening. Nothing dramatic. Just facts. Then Officer Brooks took the stand. He explained the physical evidence inside the house. The broken mug. The overturned chair. The body camera footage. Ryan looked increasingly uncomfortable. But he still seemed confident. Until Karen said 5 words. We'd like to play Exhibit 7. The courtroom lights dimmed. The ring camera footage appeared on a monitor. You couldn't see everything. But you could clearly see Ryan grabbing my arm near the front porch before forcing me inside. The room became very quiet. Ryan's attorney shifted in his chair. Judge Mitchell watched the video twice. Then she made several notes. Ryan no longer smiled. Karen called one final witness. My next witness is Mr. Jack Dawson. Dad walked to the witness stand wearing the same navy blazer he'd worn to church for years. He raised his right hand, took the oath, and sat down. Karen smiled. Mr. Dawson, were you present on the evening of February 14th? I was. What did you observe? My daughter had visible bruising. Did you threaten Mr. Carter? No. Did you strike him? No. Did you encourage anyone else to? No. Karen nodded. No further questions. Ryan's attorney stood. Mr. Dawson? Yes. You've had military training. I have. So wouldn't it be fair to say Mr. Carter found your presence intimidating? Dad looked at him for a moment before answering. I can't speak for what another man feels. A few people in the courtroom smiled. The attorney tried again. Did you tell Mr. Carter he had 5 minutes? I did. Why? So my daughter could leave safely without an argument. The attorney paused. You were once a Navy SEAL, correct? Dad nodded. Many years ago. The attorney seemed pleased. So you intentionally used that reputation to frighten my client. Dad answered with the same calm voice I'd heard my entire life. My client was my daughter. The courtroom fell silent. Even Judge Mitchell looked up from her notes. Ryan lowered his eyes to the table. For the first time since we'd arrived, he looked genuinely ashamed. After my father stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom stayed quiet for several long seconds. Judge Mitchell looked through her notes without saying a word. Ryan stared at the table in front of him. For years, I'd watched him talk his way out of uncomfortable situations. He could charm clients, smooth over mistakes at work, and convince friends that every problem was someone else's fault. That morning, none of those skills seemed to help him. Karen leaned over and whispered, "We're almost there." I nodded, but I wasn't thinking about winning. I was thinking about how strange it felt to sit only 20 feet away from the man I'd once believed I'd grow old with. Ryan's attorney made one last attempt. Your Honor, my client admits he handled the argument poorly, but we ask the court to consider that this was an isolated incident. Judge Mitchell removed her glasses. An isolated incident, she glanced at the exhibits. The court has reviewed photographs, medical records, officer testimony, body camera footage, text messages, and video evidence. She looked directly at Ryan. This does not appear isolated. Ryan finally stood. Your Honor, may I say something? She nodded. He turned toward me. Emily, I made a mistake. I waited. I never meant for any of this to happen. Again, I waited. I've lost my job. There it was. Not. I'm sorry I hurt you. Not. I'm sorry I frightened you. The first thing he mentioned was losing his job. Judge Mitchell noticed it too. Mr. Carter, she said, this hearing is about your conduct, not your employment. Ryan slowly sat back down. The judge announced a short recess before issuing her ruling. Dad and I stepped into the hallway. Neither of us spoke for a minute. Finally, I looked at him. Do you think he'll ever understand? Dad leaned against the wall. I don't know. I keep wondering if I missed something. He shook his head. You gave him years to change. I know. You didn't fail. His words settled something inside me that I hadn't even realized was still unsettled. For weeks, I'd been carrying guilt I couldn't explain. Maybe if I'd spoken up sooner. Maybe if I'd insisted on counseling. Maybe if I'd... Dad interrupted my thoughts. Emily. Yeah. Someone else's choices aren't your burden to carry. 20 minutes later, everyone returned to the courtroom. Judge Mitchell began reading her decision. Based on the evidence presented, The temporary order of protection would become permanent for the maximum period allowed under state law. Ryan was ordered to have no direct contact with me except through our attorneys regarding the divorce. The court also recommended that he complete a certified anger management program before any future request to modify the order would even be considered. As for the divorce proceedings, the judge made one additional comment. Financial transfers made immediately prior to separation will receive careful review during the division of marital assets. Karen quietly squeezed my arm. That meant the missing savings account wasn't going to disappear without questions. Ryan's shoulders slumped. For the first time since I'd met him, he looked like a man who had run out of excuses. Outside the courthouse, television cameras weren't waiting. Neither were reporters. Real life isn't usually like that. Instead, there were only a few people walking to their cars beneath a gray Tennessee sky. Ryan approached slowly. His attorney stayed several steps behind. Emily. I stopped but didn't move closer. I'm sorry. His voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. I know saying it now doesn't fix anything. No, I answered quietly. It doesn't. He looked at Dad. I judged you. Dad nodded. You did. I thought you were just... He couldn't finish the sentence. Dad helped him. An old man. Ryan lowered his head. Dad's expression never changed. Strength isn't measured by how loudly someone talks. He paused. It's measured by how safely the people around them live. Ryan stood there without another word. Then he turned, walked to his car, and drove away. I watched until he disappeared into traffic. Not because I wanted him back, but because I finally understood that letting someone go can be its own kind of victory. People sometimes ask me what happened after the courtroom. The truth is, nothing dramatic. Life didn't suddenly become perfect because a judge signed a few papers. Healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens one ordinary day after another. 6 months later, my divorce was finalized. The court ordered Ryan to return a substantial portion of the money he'd transferred out of our savings account. It wasn't easy, and it took months of paperwork, financial records, and hearings, but the truth had a way of catching up with him. I kept my Army career. In fact, I accepted a promotion that moved me into a regional logistics planning position at Fort Campbell. For the first time in years, I drove to work without feeling anxious about going home afterward. That alone felt like freedom. A few months after the divorce, I bought a small brick house less than 10 minutes from Dad's place. It wasn't large. 2 bedrooms, a front porch with a white rocking chair, a maple tree in the front yard that turned bright red every October. It felt like a fresh start. Dad still refused to let me hire anyone to fix things around the house. If you can coordinate supplies for a few thousand soldiers, he'd say with a grin, you can learn how to replace a kitchen faucet. He wasn't wrong. Saturday mornings became our tradition. Sometimes we'd fish at Kentucky Lake. Sometimes we'd stop at Cracker Barrel for breakfast before wandering through the old country store, laughing at candy we hadn't seen since I was a kid. Other weekends we'd sit on his porch with coffee while Duke slept between us. Those quiet mornings became my favorite part of the week. One afternoon I noticed Dad carrying the old military footlocker back into the garage. You locking it away again? I asked. He smiled. It doesn't belong in the middle of the living room. I laughed. Fair enough. Before closing the lid, he looked at the medals one last time. You know, he said, these aren't the things I'm proudest of. What is... He didn't hesitate. You? I felt tears sting my eyes. Me. You built your own life. He closed the lid gently. And when it became necessary, he looked at me with the same calm expression I'd known my entire life. You had the courage to rebuild it. That meant more to me than any award I'd ever received in the Army. A year later, Dad surprised everyone by joining a weekly veterans breakfast at a local diner in Dover. For decades, he'd quietly stayed away from those gatherings. Now he came home smiling, telling stories about old friends and laughing over bad coffee. I think he was healing too. As for Ryan, I heard bits and pieces through mutual friends. He completed the court-ordered anger management program. He changed jobs twice. I honestly hope he found the help he needed. Not because I wanted him back, but because I wouldn't wish that kind of anger on anyone else. If there's one lesson I've carried from all of this, it's that strength doesn't always look the way people expect. Sometimes it wears a military uniform. Sometimes it wears worn-out work boots and drives an old pickup truck. And sometimes the strongest thing you'll ever do is walk away from someone you once believed would never hurt you. If this story reminded you that quiet people often carry extraordinary strength, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Feel free to share your own experiences in the comments. And thank you for spending this time with me. I hope you'll join me again for another story. The end.